Meeting to order. Welcome everybody to the February Flagstaff Sustainability Commission meeting. I'm Amy Wolkowinski and I'm the chair. And I want to say thank you to everybody on the commission for all of the time that both the full commission and working groups have been putting in over the last few months, and to city staff too, because you guys work so hard. So thank you, everyone. And welcome to any visitors we have, and nice to see you all on Teams. All right, on to roll call. Chair Wolkowinski, present. Wait for Mary. Commissioner Bourne. Commissioner Carlson.
Present.
Commissioner Kunkel.
Present.
Commissioner Lammy.
Here.
Commissioner Skurlock.
Yes.
Vice Chair Metzger. I'd like to turn it over to Commissioner Kunkel for the land acknowledgement.
The Sustainability Commission humbly acknowledges the ancestral homelands of this area's indigenous nations and the original stewards. These lands, still inhabited by native descendants, border mountain secret to indigenous peoples. We honor them, their legacies, their traditions, and their continued contributions. We celebrate their past, present, and future generations who will forever know this place as home.
And agenda item 4 already, public comment. At this time, any member of the public may address the commission on any subject within their jurisdiction that is not scheduled before the commission on that day. Due to open meeting laws, the commission cannot discuss or act on items presented during this portion of the agenda. To address the commission on an item that is on the agenda, please either raise your hand if you're in person or use the Teams chat function. Simply type in public comment to indicate to the chair that you would like to comment. The chair will then recognize you when it's time for public comment, and staff will unmute your microphone if needed. Do we have any public comment? Okay. Item number 5, approval of the January minutes. Commissioners, has everybody had, I hope everybody's had a chance to take a look at the notes, let's say. And does anybody have any comments or recommendations or changes? Would anybody like to make a motion to approve?
I'll motion we approve minutes. Second.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a motion to approve the minutes put forward by Commissioner Lammy, seconded by Commissioner Bourne. Any discussion needed? Okay, let's vote then to approve the minutes from last month's meeting. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed, say no. All right, fantastic. January minutes are approved, and now we can move on to our first order of business for the evening. Discussion of the last cap code concepts. And I want to thank you all for being here and some of you for coming again. Our discussion got cut a bit short last time, so we have plenty of time tonight for Michelle McNulty, who's the planning director, Tiffany Antol, the zoning code manager, Genevieve Pear3, our sustainability analyst, and Jennifer Mickelson, housing planning manager, to share with us some insights about the last cap. Tia.
I just realized I did put the wrong amount of time on the agenda. You have basically the whole time.
Okay.
Except like 5 minutes at the end. So 75 minutes is inaccurate. Sorry.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
We'll certainly take it.
Is the present, can I just ask somebody to do the next slide when we do the presentation? Yeah, oh, sorry, okay, good.
You mean to move the slides
Yes,
forward?
sure. I'm sorry, it's been a day, so my words are like,
That's okay.
I to use them right. And thank you guys, thank you all for the time you gave us last time and for having us back. Next slide. So, kind of, we're gonna do a brief overview of what we gave the big presentation on. We're gonna try to just keep it high level remember we talked about these kind of concepts to reinforce them, but not spend a lot of time on them. Of course, if you have questions, please ask them, but we really want to save the bulk of this presentation for the question and dialogue slides. And so we're kind of reframing this, we talked about how we're doing this whole study through the lens of the housing and climate emergencies and trying to achieve those goals. We're gonna actually tell you what those goals are and kind of start from there. That's where we're trying to move these code directions to. Just a quick reminder of this purpose and the progress to date, and then we're gonna go over the code concepts. I'm gonna do a brief overview of those code concepts in the very beginning, but then at the end, Jennifer is going to go into a much more detailed with each one and have that time to talk about each one. So when I'm talking about it, it's just an overview. Then we'll talk about the scenarios and the key findings of the report, and then really have that discussion point stuff, question and answer. Next slide. So just so when we talk about the city and housing climate goals, specifically when we're talking about housing, the 10-year housing plan aims to reduce the affordable housing need in our community by half over the next 10 years through two elements. The impact at least 6,000 low to moderate income Flagstaff residents through a combination of unit creation or subsidy provision. And then also create or preserve almost 8,000 housing units by 2031, with a minimum of 10% of those being affordable. So this will also increase the overall supply of market rate, workforce, and affordable housing occupied by local residents. So the carbon neutrality has three primary goals that I'm sure you all are all familiar with, but achieving carbon neutrality by 2030 through a 44% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, prepare Flagstaff's communities, systems, and resources to be more resilient to climate change impacts, and address climate change in a manner that prioritizes the most impacted and ensures the costs and benefits of climate adaptation and mitigation are equitably distributed. Next slide. So just a quick reminder, this is we're in one part of a much larger process. We've completed the land availability suitability study, as well as that first code diagnostic report. And then right now we are at the code concepts to address the high level barriers that were identified in that diagnostic report. And then this is going to have its own public outreach and its own discussions, and then we'll move into the final code recommendations. I'm going to stop here and kind of maybe tell you what the ask is today, because I don't think we did that the last time we were here. So we went to housing that day, went to housing commission, and we went here, and we realized just how much information we're getting. So I think when we left here, we were kind of saying, we're going to come back, but this thing is evolving. We did go to council. We ended up giving council a much more abbreviated, like the too long didn't read, but here's like the overview of what this code concept report is. Here's the decision points that we are going to be talking about. Please go read the material and reach out to us so that we can have conversations. We have gotten some of the feedback from various members of this commission, the housing commission, and other commissions. And we will be compiling that, and that's going to start to inform our next rounds of presentations. Our goal is to have a town hall style meeting in June that involves our city council, as well as members from this commission, the housing commission, probably our transportation commission, and a few of other key, and some special interest groups in our community, and really having a much more bigger dialogue with a bigger group of people. But what we're hoping is to get this, have these conversations with you all to help us refine what is the information and kind of what is the direction we're going to be taking to the rest of those groups. And then all of that is going to inform the final code recommendations. So we're basically saying, here's some concepts of how we can address stuff. We'll refine that, and then we'll get to those final recommendations. And then just a reminder, none of this changes code. Then we have to actually do the code text amendments. But that's why we want to do all this work now, so that we're bringing the community along with us, so that when we run those code amendments through, hopefully we've spent a lot of time in the beginning to kind of be fast at the end and get those code amendments through and with the community who's coming along with that. Next slide.
Question.
Yes.
With those final code recommendations, are those presented back or just to council?
Those, no, this, then
Or
we,
just-
we rinse and repeat. We come back, no, it'll be presented back to you all in
Okay.
more iterations and hopefully we'll have a better, more refined approach or how we kind of do this with the public outreach. But yeah, you'll get to see it again.
Yes, in terms of the actualization, it all is the city council's determination, is that correct?
Yeah, so they won't be approving anything with these reports. They'll be like basically endorsing, yes, we want you to go forward with that. With the text code, the zoning code text amendments, they are the ultimate approving body of those. But we would take that, we would take whatever we presented them with all the feedback that we've gotten from this group and other groups. This is just a reminder of the significant code barriers that were identified in the diagnostic report. I won't go through these, but just this is where the several that we're going to talk about today, that's where they were born out of. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to just kind of a quick reminder of the methodology for the code concepts reports. We did a couple of things. There was some impact modeling. We actually developed prototypes, testing both the revenue impacts of potential code changes and the cost of impacts of code changes, in addition to options to reduce cost. So we're trying to do in a balanced approach. We're trying to both achieve carbon neutrality and not raise the cost of housing. So we really need to understand when we push and pull levers, what are we doing to the cost? And then the spatial analysis. So test the impact of the code concepts and the capacity of new housing in certain locations across the city for the purpose of reducing transportation related greenhouse gas emissions. So if we densify in specific areas, we kind of get the indirect benefit of achieving sustainability by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with vehicular travel. And then best practices research, again, kind of looking at the sustainability requirements and incentives, resource protection overlay, zone, reduced street risks, and then winter parking ordinance and snow removal. I do want to point out that we're really not going to talk about resource protection overlay. And that is because we actually need to decouple that and move faster, as we are seeing in other communities that are affected by wildfire. We need to be really quick with that. And this isn't just about getting density. This is about getting safe communities. We will be coming back with how we're going to be proposing to do that with council. So we're not going to talk about that much today, but I think, I know we've been working with sustainability as part of this too. I think that this will be a very good solution that we made. Okay, next slide. So this is just kind of a reminder of the report of how the report is broken down. We have the code concepts. And you know what? I'm not going to talk about those because I'm going to talk about those in the next slide. And then we have this scenarios for the code standards and incentives. So using regulations and housing types by zoning districts, maximizing density, floor area ratio, minimum parking requirements, affordable housing incentives, sustainable building incentives, and the menu of sustainable development standards. And those 7 items are going to be what Jen Michelson will be talking to you about in more detail at the end. And then I'm just going to do a brief overview on those code concepts. Oh, next slide, sorry. So big high level, the menu of sustainability and transportation demand management standards. So the interest of going to a menu or points-based approach of standards and incentives that developers can choose from to foster a higher level of sustainable design. So when we talk about a menu and points-based approach, it's like you have a minimum set of points that you have to achieve first, and then there are a selection of menu options that go with that. And those menu options are typically kind of weighted. So the things you really want to encourage and have developers bring to the table, they get a higher point to them. And then you have other things that can get you there that maybe have less points. And so the benefit of that is that it's not this prescriptive recipe that, you know, might not work for every single parcel. And it gives the developer the opportunity to kind of what works right for my site, for my product, for my online, but also then we're getting those things that the community needs to achieve our sustainability goals. TDM, transportation demand management, is a critical component of that. And that's like things like encouraging carpooling, transit-oriented design, bicycle facilities, transit passes, even how you design your site. Those are all things that can be done to really help change people's behaviors and their habits. I'm not going to spend too much time on resource protection overlay, but the big thing is that this standard shouldn't restrict the density more than the base zoning, and that was one of the major barriers that we did find from the report, from the diagnostic report. But we also need the resource protection overlay to work with our healthy forest management practices. Next slide. We're going to talk about reduced street widths, new options for narrower streets that would allow slightly higher density. They also reduce street construction costs, less pavement for all developments, and they calm traffic speeds, as well as better parking ordinance and snow removal. So having the conversation about where the community is willing to go with different ways of managing our snow, maybe just designating specific streets for snow removal instead of, so currently we just have a winter park policy that says you can't park on the streets for 6 months out of the year. Are there other ways that we can do that allow us to use our streets so that we're not requiring so much on-site parking? Next slide. And then at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Genevieve, and she's going to get into the scenarios. And I just real quickly before she does, I just want to kind of set the frame. When we talk about the scenarios, this is slightly different than the code concepts. They inform each other in the sense that these scenarios, we're saying we could change codes to have these certain outcomes. And you might tell us you want us to do certain things, but then when we talk about code concepts, we might hear other things, and that's going to help us calibrate those scenarios. And so it might not be that we end up with one of these 3 scenarios. It might be that through a combination of the feedback on all of this whole entire conversation, that we end up with a new scenario. I said Frankenstein earlier. It's not as elegant as maybe, but that we'll figure, but we will have this other, that's an option too. It's not all or nothing. We can, this is what the dialogue is about. So thanks a lot.
I'm gonna present from here unless there's a strong desire for me to go up there. Okay, cool. So
How strong does the desire have?
really strong. All right. So, yeah, so we talked about this briefly last time. And as Michelle mentioned, there were the code concepts that she just went through, and then there are the scenarios that the consultant looked at. So basically, in each of the scenarios, they pulled on different levers in their code, changing core development standards, changing the incentives, what happens. They're kind of all extremes in different directions. And so they're not really intended to be a standalone, like the end all be all. They're meant to be like, if we do this, go really far construction, this is what would happen. And so just to kind of give us a sense of what these different calibrations and different standards would look like. So the first one is optimizing design and the incentives. So basically the benefits that a developer would get for taking the sustainable design standards or the affordable housing incentives. And so I'll talk a little bit more in detail about what that includes. Then the second scenario, the consultant looked at what happens if we elevate sustainable design features for all developments, as well as include things to increase market rate housing production. And then the third one is how do we increase, they looked at basically increasing density to support market rate housing. So very similar to scenario 2, just without those elevated sustainable design features. And as Michelle mentioned, really the intent is to pick and choose from the different scenarios to find something that best advances housing and climate goals together. All right, next slide. So I'm going to go into the scenarios in a little bit more detail. This slide talks about what's in the existing code, so that's just a reference. So I'm just going to start on scenario 1 though. So that's the one where we optimize the incentives for both sustainable design and affordable housing. So we don't change the code for all projects, just for projects that take those incentives. The incentives, what you'd have to do to get the incentives would stay the same, but you'd have major increases in density And then major reductions in parking. So basically the intent is to make those incentives more financially appealing to developers. So to increase the chance that they will actually use those incentives. So the next slide. So scenario 2, again, that's the one focused on elevating sustainable design and increasing housing production, specifically market rate housing production. So it increases the maximum allowed density in most of the residential zones and commercial zones by a lot. It also reduces minimum required parking spaces by quite a bit. It also allows single-use residential buildings to be permitted in commercial zones. So right now, if you want to build residential and only do residential, not mixed use, you need a conditional use permit. So this looked at if we just allowed that by right, what would happen? It also introduces FAR or floor area ratio caps in most zones. And I will talk about what that is a little bit, but it's basically a tool that could potentially encourage developers to build smaller unit sizes. And then the biggest, most relevant to this commission is that it applies new sustainability standards to all projects. That's kind of the changes to the base code. And then it also includes changes to the incentives. So having elevated sustainability standards for projects, if anyone wants to take the incentives above and beyond the base code, they could do that, but it have to be a higher level of design. It also includes, again, minor increases in density for projects that take those incentives, sustainability incentives. And actually, this part applies sustainability and affordable housing incentives, and then major parking reductions for folks who take the incentives. So the focus in this scenario is on the base code with some minor changes to the incentives. Next slide. And then scenario 3, again, is very similar to scenario 2, very similar increases in density, except slightly higher in commercial zones, same decrease in minimum parking requirements, also allows single-use residential buildings in commercial zones. And the incentives, no changes to the incentives requirements, but like what they actually have to do to get the incentives, but if people do take the incentives, that's a bonus. A minor density bonus and a major parking reduction. So pretty similar to scenario 2. Basically, the difference between the two, biggest difference is there's no sustainable development standards for the menu that folks would choose from. And the no floor area ratio caps. And anyone please stop me if you have questions on these. Okay.
What's the
Yeah.
current parking minimum requirement?
Ooh, good question. Good thing I have that as an extra slide. So the current parking requirement for existing code is, Tiffany, let me know if I'm off on this, is one. Well, it depends on how many bedrooms you have, but the average was 1.75 spaces per unit. Yeah,
And a reduction.
the average, because you have more parking spaces for more bedrooms, but the average is 1.75
And
per residential unit.
So to go from 1.75 to 1 to 1.5 is considered a major reduction.
It's pretty big. I mean, maybe depends on how you define major, but it's definitely a reduction. So, and then additional reductions for other reductions.
I had the same question when I was looking over things, and in the diagnostic report, they summarize, not in all the detail, breaking out residential, but residential was 1 to 3.
Yeah.
Depending. So if you look at taking it from 3 to
Yeah,
1.25,
could be pretty.
then
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's true. It depends on the unit size. It would be a bigger reduction.
If your whole project is all 5 bedrooms, it's a pretty drastic, but if your project is all studios, it's not.
Because that also simplifies it rather.
You're talking about the dense ones too, we're not talking about.
They could do more if they chose to.
A development that is
We're talking about
10,000s. Developments that are over 10,000 square feet, which doesn't hit most residential projects. It hits some commercial projects. We actually don't allow you to exceed maximums by more than 5% unless you put in a parking garage. So we don't want to see mass amounts. I mean, we have always anticipated that we don't want to see more parking than necessary on certain sites. So it's good. Garage is discouraged.
Mary.
Oh, that's what she was saying. We're talking about, we're not talking about, we're talking about apartment complexes and townhouses, et cetera. We're not talking about smaller individual housing, et cetera. We're talking about commercial.
We're talking about all of them.
Yeah.
All right, okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the kind of technical aspects of what we're looked at in each of the scenarios. I won't go into a ton of detail because we did talk about it a little bit last time, but just kind of want to show. So these are the different things that the consultant basically calibrated throughout the different scenarios. So the first one is density. So go to the next slide. So this is the current density in the code compared to what they tested under scenarios 1, 2, and 3. So we can see existing code compared to scenario 1, for example. The base density is the same, but if you take the sustainability or affordable housing incentives, and that S at the top is sustainability incentives, and the A is affordable incentives, the density increases. You get a density bonus there, so you can see that across the different zones. And then in scenario 2, we can see that the density increases in the base code, and then you have additional increases for taking the sustainable residential building standards and the affordable housing standards. So, so basically we can see that's kind of how they played around with density in those. And as I mentioned, scenario 2 and 3 are very similar. The only differences in terms of density increases are just slightly higher density increases in scenario 3 in the commercial zones. That's that under the purple category on the right side of the table. But again, that's just what they tested. So it's not like we're set in stone with scenario 3 or 2, like what they did in that. You kind of have that inform that final scenario as well. Next slide. So this looks at the density bonuses in the incentives. So that's the additional density that a project would get for taking either the sustainable residential building incentives or the affordable housing incentives. So we can see the largest increase in the density bonus is in scenario 1, which makes sense because in that one, they went all in on the incentives and they tested that to see what it would look like. In scenarios 2 and 3, there's greater increases in density in the base code. So there still are density bonuses, but they're not quite as substantial as in scenario 1. Slide. So I mentioned floor area ratio caps. So that's something that the consultant tested in scenario 2. So that's basically another way to think about lot coverage. So right now our residential zones regulate development. One way they regulate it is through lot coverage. There's a maximum amount of the area of a lot that a project can cover. So for example, in the single family residential zone, a house can cover no more than 35% of the lot area. But this actually looks at the total, but you can basically build a tall house that's very big. So you could have a 5,000 square foot house. You could cover 5,000 square foot lot. You could have a 35% lot coverage. You could build a really, really big house still by doing that. But this looks at the total floor area of the building. So if you have an FAR cap, it regulates how big the building can be in relation to the size of the lot. It is a tool to encourage the development of smaller units. So in this diagram, 1 story, so the image on the left, that's 100% lot coverage or an FAR, a floor area ratio of 1.0. So that's the same to say the lot is 5,000 square feet. That building is a 1-story, 5,000 square foot building. In the middle one, you have 2 stories, so still a 5,000 square foot building, but now it's only covering half of the lot. So those could potentially each be their own unit. They don't have to be, but they could. And then the 4 stories image on the right, so same size building, but it's only taking up a quarter of the lot area. And again, there's the potential for those to be individual units versus having one large building that's just 1 unit. Cameron, I saw you with that. Yeah.
So it's a tool to increase, you said smaller units, right? Is it because you have that same size building that's stacked, and so by having more stories, you're more likely to have another unit? Or can you clarify?
Yeah, so basically, please jump in over there if I'm missing anything. So basically, right now in residential zones, we only regulate the % lot coverage. So people just can't cover more than 35% of their lot, for example, in the R1 zone, but they can build as big a house as they want as long as they're not increasing height. So height and lot coverage are what's regulating the size of the building. There's not really anything else. Like, for example, if you build 1 single family home, there's no cap on how big it can be as long as you meet that lot coverage and that height, that lot coverage maximum and height maximum. So FAR cap could say, well, you can't have a FAR greater than 2, for example, which would then actually limit the building envelope. So it kind of has to do more with the shape of the building and how big it is. So if you're trying to maximize density, you're only allowed to have an FAR of a certain amount. If you make more money off of more units, it could encourage developers to do 2 units instead of 1, for example. But it really has to be calibrated correctly, and it has to be calibrated also with the density. I feel like I don't know if I did the best job of explaining that, but it's definitely a tool. It's not perfect, but it's something that can encourage smaller units if it's calibrated correctly with density maximums and with height and things like that. Oh gosh, what's the question?
I think we.
Sparrow is next.
I was gonna ask the stupidest question, so I'm okay. So my thinking about this, on the single family development, so there's this 35% use of the lot. Once they purchased it, once they built the house, can they then expand it or add more things to the lot? Are there any regulations that says, oh, now we can have 2 little houses behind our big house?
Well, it depends on what they're building. If their house is already covering 35% of their lot, they cannot expand out and cover more of their lot. They could build an ADU, which is exempt from lot coverage requirements. But we're looking at new development, so we're not looking at existing.
It's not something I plan to do in my own backyard, but I just thought that's an interesting regulation. But how far down the road does the regulation go? How much does it really cover?
Basically, you have, your building is supposed to be conformance to the zoning code.
So, as you say, the first level building is 35%, but then later on, what was the you used?
Well, so they're 2 different standards. So right now we have lot coverage is the only thing I'm regulating. I don't know if would lot coverage and FAR go together, or is it one or the other?
So it's really funny, right now in our commercial zone, it's only FAR. In our industrial zones, it's both a lot coverage and an FAR, because it depends on how you're trying to, for what purpose you're using the tool. So it's, again, like she said, we would just need to calibrate it for the specific use of what we're trying to accomplish. Go ahead.
I guess I'm just trying to figure out, as far as like limiting to make increase less for smaller buildings, is the goal of that more density or is it more affordability? Because I'm just trying to figure out, like, when you have 25% lot coverage, are they gonna go build more stuff on that lot for density, or how is that gonna affect density if there's not, I mean, it's their lot, so they're not gonna have some other person developing it.
Yeah, so the idea in this scenario is density goes up a lot too, parking goes down, that's what they tested. And then as part of that, if you have an FAR cap, it could also encourage developers to build smaller units, but it's not by itself. Right now, if we had FAR caps, it might not do us very much because we need to do other things. So it's really hard to meet your maximum density anyway. So the idea is that if you're only allowed to have a building that is so large in relation to the size of your lot, you'll make more money if you build more units, but those units will be smaller. So that's kind of where all those pieces come together.
So it's more here for like a developer that's gonna develop a bunch of apartment complexes.
Or even a small triplex or, duplex. too.
Right, so there's a lot of little moving pieces, right? So the affordability component could really, one of the things we're hearing is folks want to see smaller houses being introduced on the market. With land values as high as they are, what we're seeing are units that are pacing with the value of land rather than building smaller units. And so that's part of the feedback in the home ownership market. Now, when you look at and home ownership is not just limited, of course, to single family detached. It's that certain kind of model. But, the size of units in multifamily, it varies, right? In some ways, if 6 people lived together in an apartment unit and had 6 bedrooms, maybe the rent proportionally is smaller per bedroom unit for the individual, but for a family, now that rent is quite extensive, right? So it's all relative to the situation and the actual project. But a lot of the community feedback we've received over time, especially in terms of some multifamily projects, is that, not all units are calibrated the same. So a studio, when we talk about density, A studio is one unit, the same way as a 5-bedroom apartment is one unit. They're treated equally under that standard. And implementing something like FAR could help us balance maybe getting better ratio of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5-bedroom units is the hope.
Gotcha, thank you.
I'm wondering what data you have that shows that limiting the FAR will actually encourage development of more units, because it seems to me that it's easier to build larger units and you're definitely gonna get more money for them. So for like, as a builder, how does FAR incentivize building more units?
FAR alone does not incentivize. It absolutely doesn't. It's a controlling lever. Density incentivizes. The increase in density incentivizes the developer. FAR is a way to control that density, to say, well, we want this density, but we want to achieve as many units as possible. So FAR is a lever we can pull on to say, if we were only inundated with all 5-unit apartments, we're not getting the diversity. So FAR is just a tool to try to force the market to give us that diversity of housing choices.
Then you have to allow the developer more density so they can get more of.
Right,
those smaller
right, because
houses.
just the FAR means
Yeah.
it doesn't do anything for the floor area.
Agreed.
It's just the ratio. And so you have to, like, it has to be paired with density so that you're not having that, like, in residential 35% or whatever.
Yes. Yeah, 100%.
So is that why a lot of these like conversations and scenarios is about the points and the density bonus? Because the bonus, like, yeah, it allows them to build a little more units. And so you get smaller units potentially.
You mentioned commercial as a big part of this scenario.
I was just referencing commercial parking as a.
So, I mean, for the commercial company is the one that wants to have the 5 stories and all that space park.
So this is part of that conversation because we are looking at the density standards in the commercial zones. So this is talking about allowing single-use residential and mixed-use residential, both commercial zones. So they're.
One last, can I add one thing?
Yeah.
I just moved so I could see everyone, by the way. So I think, so we presented at the Housing Commission earlier today, and Tiffany, I think, had a really good point that I don't think has been mentioned yet today here, is that we have tools to create smaller lots, but we don't really have tools to create smaller units right now. Right now, we're seeing small lots and houses taking up a lot, and not necessarily getting smaller houses. So, but it is really important to think about density and FAR working together, because by itself, FAR is not going to get us where we want to go. But yeah, it's a lever that we can pair with density to encourage a greater mix of units.
That works with apartments and townhouses, et cetera. It doesn't work with single family houses.
It can work with single family too. Depends on where it's applied and how it's calibrated. Yeah.
This might be, I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this, but it seems to me like FAR is a way to control the density. So for example, like if you have a lot and you have the FAR of 1, right? If you have that density, or if you have the FAR capped at 1, then any one of those 3 scenarios meets that FAR. But you can't. So are you saying that,
Let me
like,
give you-
for the third scenario, you can build 2 of those buildings? Because 2 of those buildings would make the FAR 2. So I don't understand, like, I'm not understanding why walls within the building are affected by the FAR.
Sure. So let's talk about an example. 9,000 square foot lot. They say they can have a 4-plex, right? That's actually a pretty substantial amount of density on 9,000 square feet. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head. If you limit the FAR to 0.5, which is half the size of that lot, that 4-plex would be limited to 4,500 square feet, right? So each one of those units, so just breaking it down, each one of those units is about 1,000 square feet. Can you fit a 5-bedroom apartment in 1,000 square feet? No.
I see.
So each one of those units, so you could do 1 5-bedroom and 3 1-bedrooms. Or you could do all 2 bedrooms likely within 1,000.
Isolation. I think the
Okay.
bedrooms are like a lot of the
That makes
student-like
sense.
housing where they're renting
Okay.
for, so they're like incentivized to.
Thank you.
So they can.
Thank you.
That
Has a question.
Well, I was just gonna add, I happened to be in Denver in 2015. And what happened is that they did not use something like FAR. And so what they saw, they increased density. And so on the residential lots where they had really small, older homes, they ended up getting a duplex that was about 3,000 square foot units. And it took up the entire lot and it completely dominated this existing neighborhood. And it was like, yeah, there's density, but density for whom? Right, because they didn't use that FAR tool. So I just wanted to add that because whenever we think about, and that's like half of Denver now, because they did this. And so it's complicated and I'm really glad we're talking about it, but it's kind of a way to, again, it's, as Tiffany says, it's one tool, but it's a way to get a little bit towards what we want, which is those smaller units, which is greater affordability.
Thank you, though. This is a tough topic that we'll have to grapple with.
Good luck.
Get direction to include that.
It's a very visual.
Another follow-up question.
Yeah.
Do you have more on this slide?
On FAR.
You know what? I was going to jump in and say we do have a question specific to floor area ratio. And I promise it's quite simplistic. We're not trying to solve in the weeds problems with, in our discussion today. It's just like, are you interested in like
Yeah.
pursuing FAR as a tool?
Totally.
Throughout the rest of the zoning code. So, because it's currently so limited, like how it's being used now, and it's only in certain zones, and do we want to expand that? So that is the question. It's
I
frankly really simple.
I think what's like kind of missing for me, at least on this, is that like there's not perhaps the visual examples or written how it will help. And so like this conversation, discussion definitely clarified that, but it's like missing in like the presentation.
Sure, we can add that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I know like the conversation is evolving. So.
I wanted to search YouTube for like a really great educational tool that showed like an animated dynamic thing of like, if you do this, then you do that. If you do that, you know what I mean? So
Yeah,
that you
that'd be
can
cool.
see the units multiply.
Yeah.
And the size of them relative to like what it would be.
Denver might do that.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like both a tool, but it's also like a visual tool. And I know visuals are a big concern for like, I don't know, the everyday resident. And so that you can like achieve affordable housing and, you know, fit it into existing neighborhoods. Yeah, seems like a great tool.
Yeah, thanks for that suggestion. We're refining this every time we present, so thank you for giving us feedback. This is a tough one, so I agree. I think the visuals of the examples that Jenny and Tiffany did.
Yeah.
So, cool. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So this one actually is still FAR. Yay, we're almost done. So this is just looking at how they explored it across the different scenarios. So they decided to test it in scenario 2 just to kind of isolate its effects, but again, like, we're not wedded to one scenario over the other. It's just kind of like, this is where it was and this is how we wanted to look at it. So our cars, I think Tiffany mentioned, our zoning code currently has FAR caps in some commercial zones, whereas this is proposing to add it to residential as well. Just kind of wanted to see, Tilton wanted to see what would happen if we did that. Next slide. So parking. So another big component of all 3 scenarios is reduced parking. So in scenario 1, it's the incentive. So basically projects that take either the sustainability or the affordable housing incentive get a big reduction in required parking. So in scenario 1, if they were a 20-unit multifamily development, they would have 20 parking spaces that was required minimum. That'd be 15 for residents plus 5 guest parking spaces, which is quite a bit less than what is required today. Scenarios 2 and 3 focus on changing parking for all development, not just development that takes the incentives. So that goes down to 1.25 parking spaces per unit plus guest spaces. So the total is 30 parking spaces. So as we mentioned in the question before, our current code allows parking is dependent on how many bedrooms are in a unit, so this is a reduction from what is currently allowed in the code. Yes.
For this, for these standards, can you apply different standards for different types of housing or where they are, or is it like pretty much a one rule fits all?
Yeah, options. So yeah, you can apply for different, like, one of the questions we have is about, where, if we reduce parking, where we want to do that everywhere, we want to do it along transit corridors, like, so there's definitely lots of options to think about where this makes sense. And I'll just say from looking at other cities that have reduced parking, it's not, there's lots of options for how this could look. And lots of cities have already done it in different ways, and we would not be the first to change our parking requirements. So there's definitely options. Okay, next slide. Okay, and this is my last slide, and then we'll pass it on to Jen after this. So this is looking at the sustainability standards by scenario. So I mentioned scenario 1 looks at optimizing the incentives. So basically, it takes the standards that we currently have in our code, which are all electric building, water resource protection, materials management, and EV charging. So we currently have those standards in our code, but basically keep those the same, other than in giving a lot higher density bonus and a big parking reduction. In scenario 2, however, though, that scenario explored expanding the sustainability features to have a base requirement across all design or all development. But the idea is probably something like a points-based system where developers could choose which options work better for them. So say they have to get up to 10 points. You would give more points for things you want to incentivize more. They basically have some sort of baseline and to require sustainability features across all development, but give developers the flexibility to choose what works best for them and their project, as long as they meet the minimum number of points. And then it also looked at enhancing the, and then including a couple extra sustainability incentives for even more elevated design, and then including, but basically having it be more of a base requirement. And then scenario 3 goes back to having the incentives the way that they are now. It doesn't put, or sustainability incentives the way that they are now, it has them as incentives. It doesn't have them in the base code. So basically, they just looked at these different things and figured out, what would happen, how, if we kind of pushed and pulled on the levers in our core base code and incentives. So that's all I have. I'm going to pass it on to Jen Michelson.
Thanks. All right, so I'm going to spend a couple slides walking us through the key findings and implications of the report. Very helpfully laid out for us. So yeah, if we're just talking about the implications of each of these scenarios, what they tell us is that under scenario 1, we can improve our ability to get the affordable units and the sustainability features that we want, just by increasing the attractiveness of those incentives. But we'd be leaving the other code requirements as is, and that doesn't do a lot to help us reach our housing production goals. And with scenario 2, if we package the sustainability standards, or new and enhanced sustainability standards with increased density and parking reductions, we can see a big increase in that housing production. But we would need to be, we know we need to be careful not to give away too much density or too much reduction in parking to the point where the affordable housing incentives are ineffective, because so much by right density and parking reduction is just a given for everybody. We still need to keep those incentive levers in mind. With scenario 3, we are again using increased density and parking reductions overall to achieve max housing production numbers. But this scenario, there's no enhanced sustainability requirements included, and therefore, we have fewer carbon neutrality outcomes able to be achieved under this scenario. So they really did, obviously, scenario 2 is the focus where we're really trying to elevate sustainable features. Yeah.
I see FAR mentioned on scenario 2, but that was the only one that it was applied to,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
it could also be applicable for other scenarios, right?
We could have, that wasn't absolutely, I picked that up reading the report. I asked the consultants, like, why can't we do incorporate FAR requirements or experiments, into scenario 3. And they, like Genevieve said, they just wanted to isolate different outcomes per scenario. But obviously we can choose, be like, hey, we'll be taking that one,
Yeah. Like it could
incorporating
be a
it.
good tool
Yes,
for another scenario.
right. It's not like it can't be done. It's just they didn't test it under that scenario. They really were just focused on kind of a more straightforward approach to housing production. And of course, the downside, unfortunately, with the scenario 3 was it was all like full force housing production, but the affordable housing also can kind of suffer if you're not, like we said, if we're just giving so much density by right, and any developer can go and build like a very, very dense project, they wouldn't really be motivated necessarily to use those affordable housing incentives to get those restricted units. So regardless of our path forward, we need to be kind of monitoring and calibrating density and everything else to see how it impacts the desirability of our pretty basic, affordable housing. I mean, standard, like not citywide, nationally, density and parking reductions, density bonuses and parking reductions are like the go-to incentive tool. It's really the primary way to get people housing. So, and the next slide. Just continuing with a handful of these, there's like 5 major takeaways here. No shocker. Number 1, it's expensive to develop in Flagstaff, very challenging, very expensive land. Like nobody needs to be convinced, I don't think. Number 2, across all scenarios, parking reductions are critical to the market feasibility of higher density housing. So we keep running into that, like devote less land to parking in order to achieve the housing outcomes. Number 3, if the city desires to concentrate density in areas where households are driving less. I didn't know if people are familiar with vehicle miles traveled, that term in this commission. Yes. So yeah, if people are driving less already in certain areas of town, then, perhaps like targeted rezonings or an overlay zone, proximity-based code regulations would be really effective in increasing density in those areas rather than just like blanket applying density everywhere. All right, and then the 4th kind of takeaway was if our goal is to broadly increase density throughout the community, then updating the core development standards in general can just get us there. If we just allow more density in every zone and don't put any location specifics on it, we certainly could see like negative housing production that way. But is that, let's talk. All right, so, and then the
That you have to go look at Prescott.
yeah, I mean, yeah, we have, yes, okay, totally other topic, but yes, so and then the 5th takeaway here is just this increase in housing production under scenario 1, that was the incentive focused scenario. It's really highly dependent on increased use of density bonuses under those incentive programs. And it doesn't do a whole lot for really, I don't want to say flood the market, but like creating more housing production overall. We can't guarantee that we would get a lot more housing production by just.
Do we have a sense of the ratio between multifamily and single family that it's going to need to be to achieve the goals in the first side?
Like the breakout of how many multifamily.
Right. I mean, we know the space. It's pretty well defined what's available to build on. And if we want to get this many houses and this much people taken care of, then there's some relationship, I would think, between those two things, how much of this versus that.
What's a golden, that's something that's really hard. Like the city can't necessarily set a ratio and go out to try to, like we can't require
Multifamily on somebody
or
else's.
know that we would get that in each particular place. So the report worked in much more kind of general numbers. It was just, and I have a slide here later where it just counts housing units total and it didn't differentiate whether that unit was an ownership or rental. But it did count up all of the land area among each zoning category and like what's the acreage there, what's the potential, if we manipulate densities in all of these zoning categories, like what's the output, you know?
That's what he was asking.
It's wild, yeah, and but they're just housing units over like like a round number and not like a ratio.
I mean, I think just the math says we don't have a lot of land. We're gonna need it to be multifamily housing for the most part. We've been building a lot of single family housing out on the edges, to make the numbers that we need. It needs to be a lot of multifamily housing and more that we're building now. I think is that fair, Jen?
That the ratio of new development is mostly rental versus ownership.
No, just to say that like with the limited land Flagstaff has, our
Yeah.
new development is going to need to be mostly multifamily housing to meet our housing needs.
And that could still be an ownership model. It doesn't have to be rental.
Yep.
Attached units.
I have a little bit of a technical zoning question, but how much of like the existing single family house zoning is vacant lots? So in a way like.
So as you're looking at that map right in
Yeah.
front of you, it's all in that southern portion of the city. And then there's a little bit off, like it's all the southern area in and around where the hospital is being proposed. So you see those big,
Chunks that don't,
that's where the bulk of it is.
yeah,
Well,
yeah,
The JWP, the John Wesley Powell corridor.
yeah.
And, but over
And
as
then-
well, the hospital and then back up.
Maybe I've missed it, but is it part of the conversation to like switch those to not restricted to just single family, like?
They're-
Family?
Actually not restricted to just single family. We actually allow multifamily residential in almost all of our residential zones.
Okay.
It's just that the density is too low.
Even if it's a duplex or is that what you're saying?
Right, so if you want to build a duplex, if you want to build a duplex in the R1 zone, you're gonna need to have about a 12,000 square foot lot, between 12, 13, 14,000 square foot lot. So that's what I mean by the density is too low to really get that model of housing.
Okay. So with some of these proposed changes, we could have like duplexes and triplex stuff in the single family areas.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that's the other presentation that's missing is there's a House bill that's already approved. We have to expand what we already allow in single family zones to go all the way up to a fourplex.
Sorry, back to FAR, but just with this conversation, thinking, how does multifamily home work with that? Because you'd think that you'd want less restrictions, if multiple families are living there.
That's why in most of the multiple family zones, so it's about calibrating the development in that zoning district, right? So in the multifamily, that you would have a much higher FAR allowance. And as the intensity of the zoning district goes up.
So this slide, this is a synthesis of how each scenario supports outcomes that we called for in our 10-year housing plan and carbon neutrality plans. It's a really simplified version of the anticipated impacts on housing and climate outcomes from the memo, if you read that. It was quite challenging to try to simplify to this degree. And that's why we went ahead and just like listed all of the outcomes that we are trying to go for. Like we have a carbon neutrality plan, 10-year housing plan, check. What do those plans ask for? What are the outcomes we are like wanting that those plans are calling for? And how does each scenario address, to what degree does each scenario address each of those outcomes? So that was what was the memo. And this is, yeah, it was quite hard to try to, because everything has like a little caveat and there's so much nuance, but we wanted to visually show you guys that scenario 2 does the best job at reaching the goals of both. So,
And I apologize for the naivete of this question. When you're working with these plans and you're discussing them and you're having all this dialogue, do you ever have construction people in the conversation with you so they can say, oh, you know what, that's not gonna work, or I mean, people who are actually going to have to do the building?
when we had a lot of the earlier phase of this project incorporated stakeholder engagement where they were builders,
Yes,
The
okay.
stakeholders being developers, architects, engineers, people who use our technical codes. And they helped us identify all of the struggles that they have with our codes. Like, it's really hard, you know, this is a problem here, like, this is why these.
And we have to work around it. It's too hard to deal with, so they gave you that feedback.
Right, so we have that feedback as part of the phase. And we're starting to like churn the wheels and be like, does this address those, you know, those barriers? So that's where we're at right now. I do want to acknowledge, I didn't quite know if you were suggesting that like when we're making our plan, like when we make our carbon neutrality and then take our housing plan. I mean, it's more about like, what's our goal rather than like who's, I mean, yeah, I would say that I'm sure developers, you know, and all the right people were included in the creation of those plans, but ultimately it's just like, what is this plan setting out to achieve? It's this thing. And not every single individual in the city is going to be super supportive.
Tell me that it's their experience. Developers probably have the least resistance. For sure.
Sure.
So
And we know that,
yeah.
yeah. So as we go forward, we want to make sure that there, thank goodness, the consultants have a way of running these financial models and they can develop prototypes and see financially what is workable and worthwhile for developers. And it's not perfect, right? Like, we're kind of operating off of assumptions here, and that's all that.
We're all operating today and then 6 years down the road,
Exactly.
we're gonna look at it.
But if we can if we can run through some modeling and see that a developer is much more inclined to deliver what we want these things over here, if we change these things, then, and we have something to kind of point to. And obviously when talks and so it's positively impacting here. Our financial
Conservation.
yeah. And that was a really great, I mean, that, I guess I don't really need to be reminded of that, but it was a really great feedback, a little point we got in the last commission. Remember, they're driven by the bottom line. So,
As are we all. As are
sure,
people
sure.
buying
There's
houses.
nothing really wrong with it if it's the reality of how everything's gonna get changed. So yeah, the next two slides are, you know, just, this is that table I was discussing that really is just showing the net housing unit production under each scenario. No surprise, scenario 3 maxed it out most at almost 97,000 new units citywide. Scenario 2, not too far behind, and scenario 1 also an increase. And all of these scenarios are clearly an improvement over our existing code if we were to do nothing. So that was just kind of cool to see these.
So a unit again is a bedroom, a bathroom, a front door.
You know, I would have to look deep into the code to see what qualifies. If they did just like an average size, if it was like a 2-bedroom.
Or a studio apartment, is that a unit?
Or
Or
if-
4-bedroom apartment or 4-bedroom house is a unit?
Yeah, I mean,
That's a good
it
point.
could be a big
It's a
mix
big-
of all.
It's just the unit, it could be a studio up to a bigger bedroom, it's just the self-contained.
It's just, yeah, a unit in general, but
But that's not
So
required.
you're wondering
How
how
many
many
people?
size of these proposed.
How many
might
people
be.
are actually accommodating?
Yeah.
Because when you got all the measures, it's kind of hard to put it all in one
Yeah.
scenario to see what that actually means.
Yeah, I think to kind of piggyback off that, it sounds like it's asking like, yeah, what their average size of the unit is, and so how many people that might be accommodating. You know, is that a
yeah, I don't
two-bedroom?
know it off the top of my head. I
Okay,
could
yeah.
dig into the report to look into the appendices.
Sure.
Because it should have been modeled, built into their assumptions, which were in the appendix.
Imagine
What's
it's-
the ratio? It'd be more with one than the others.
Yeah, like how many people are we really helping with all these units? Because if it was 96,000,
That's a lot
you
of
know,
something.
studio apartments.
Also, like, you know, you have, yeah, they could all be one bedroom, so.
Still 96,000 people,
Yeah.
that's a lot of people.
Get that here. And affordable.
You can do the next slide. We're really close. We have like an hour left to do our blog questions. So, yeah, this slide was just really helpful in kind of clarifying that scenario 2 by far achieves more substantial carbon or greenhouse gas emission reduction. If you're a sustainable incentive project under scenario 2, you're reaching like 60% fewer emissions. And not surprisingly, scenarios 1 and 3 perform less well. And yeah, like a buy right or an affordable incentive project under scenario 1 or 3 is basically the same as what we're currently seeing. So they're clear winner there as far as emissions goes. So we can get into the next question. And the first question we have is, really just which outcomes do we want to prioritize going forward? Like in the memo, you saw how we anticipated outcomes, each plan's outcomes under each scenario, and this is that simplified summary. Where is this commission headed as far as scenarios and outcomes? And there's that secondary question that we got below too. If you guys wanted to see any zoning districts excluded or treated differently moving forward. Discuss.
I would just like to say that, especially since you preface this discussion by saying that these scenarios are like what the consultants put together to really like isolate different levers and see how those affect it. I think that, perhaps the discussion should be more about which of those levers seem the most important, because I think that the goals that we want to achieve in Flagstaff, not just on sustainability or the housing commission, are to have more affordable housing and, support our carbon neutrality goals. So if you look at this simplified thing, then scenario 2, but there were, things that were in the other scenarios that might be beneficial, and I'm not positive that scenario 2 is the right scenario. So that's.
We have questions for each of those levers where we're
Okay.
trying to like how to proceed down our own path, those other.
And then you could, there was an interesting little commentary on NPR as I was leaving late to get here. Apologize. They commented that there's going to be a vote in the summer for the community to determine what green spaces are going to be maintained, which once that vote comes through, if the election comes out there one door, in order to change a zone, you would have to go back to the community to have them vote for it. There's green zones. It's not just anything. So there's going to be a lot of different things impacting this. Are we looking at all and community involvement and not involvement? I mean that. Selling the product. I guess that's what I wanted to ask about. You know what I'm talking about?
No.
Commissioner Munster, can you clarify, was that about Flagstaff?
Yes.
Okay, so that was probably a reference to the regional plan, which I think maybe Genevieve could talk about the religious.
I think I heard it too,
zone.
actually. Yeah, I was curious because I caught not all of it.
Yeah.
It was like a way to more permanently restrict open space
That's right.
and protect it from future development by
That's right.
putting it to the voters. But I mean,
Yes.
and I don't know
It sounds like
something-
if it comes out that way, then there won't be able to use any of the green space unless you get voters to approve it.
And I was like, I haven't heard
We'll look into that.
Yeah, we don't,
Yeah,
we're
I was
not,
like, I couldn't-
we don't know.
Yeah.
We'll need to look into
The
that.
staff in the room are the ones who
Yeah.
know about that.
I
You
know,
know,
you don't
so
know.
we'll look into it.
There's an open space commission. right?
Yeah,
And
I think let's keep this focused.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It's like the opposite.
I was just thinking about all this discussion, all this work, all this direction we're going in. If we're not doing something to sell the product, it's not going to come to any fruition. That's all.
Commissioner Fumble. Okay, so a lot of this is over my head and I'm trying my best to follow along. I'm back on the table right before the one that says the total capacity for codes. And the existing code has the capacity for 48,000 new units. Like there are, 90,000 people that live in Flagstaff. So if we're saying we have the capacity right now to build 47,000 new units, assume at least 2 people live per unit. Let's say we have like the capacity right now with the existing code to double the Flagstaff population. Right, so no, and I don't think that's gonna happen in 10 years, or maybe, but I don't think so. So looking at all of the total possible capacity for all scenarios, like none of them are actually going to reach 96,000. Like we're not building 96,000 new houses in 10 years.
Right,
So
there's no-
what's the benefit of looking at the total net new capacity as one of the deciding factors over 10 years, when no matter what code we use, the possibility is not gonna be breached. Like, no matter what, we're not gonna hit that number. So why is that part of the deciding factor? Jen, does that make sense?
No, this is about what the capacity is with the zonings that we have.
Right.
Not what necessarily what we're gonna achieve in the next 10 years. But if we just, if in 100 years we develop out and we just keep with the
Mhm.
existing code requirement, we'll only ever achieve 47,592.
Yeah, okay.
If we change our codes based on scenario 2 and 3, then in the future, with the lands that we have now available, we could achieve higher numbers, is the point. It's not that
Okay.
we're going to hit those numbers in 10 years, it's
Okay.
that
That makes more sense. I was
with
like really
that-
struggling with understanding
Sorry.
why we're considering building 100,000 new units in the 10-year housing plan.
And I think like-
Where are you gonna live? Where are you gonna move to?
Yeah.
I mean, that
Okay,
physically
so
won't
this is
happen.
like very long-term, looking ahead, changing the code, expecting the code then to potentially remain the same for the next 50 years.
Right, and this is just talking about how we can make better use of the lands that we have available to us. Flagstaff is pretty much landlocked. We don't have a huge supply.
And if I could add, I think one thing that I find really helpful to think about in this is who is the new housing serving? Like right now, we're getting kind of bigger single family homes that aren't really, they're really expensive, you know, it's really hard for local folks to buy them. So, you know, I think, and we're landlocked, so we only have so much land to develop. So the way that I think really helps me to think about this project is like, we need more housing, but we need more housing that serves folks throughout the community with different needs and different income levels. That also help us meet our carbon neutrality goals. So that's kind of what I find helpful, because yeah, we could still get new housing, but in our current, we continue as business as usual. Is it gonna help us get where we really want to go as a community?
I mean, and I think I know that this is part of the 10-year housing plan and that we probably fought really hard as a city to get it, but that 10% benchmark of only 10% of new adults to be affordable, like to me, that is the problem. Right, like, that means what, 10% of new builds are the average person can afford to buy? So, like,
Yeah.
how can we incentivize more affordable units is where I would like to see the scenarios play out.
When they're talking about apartments, you're talking about somebody
Any,
who wants to
any
buy a
units,
house.
or rent, or buy an apartment, or buy a
Condo,
condo,
yeah.
like literally anything. Nobody can afford to buy anything here. So to incentivize only 10% of new construction to be affordable, to me is, and I know that was probably already controversial to get that into the housing plan, but
Right.
that would be my suggestion of like, how do we improve the scenarios? How do we get some more affordable housing is good?
in housing, we talk about big A affordable, little A affordable, and big A is like restricted, like you have to qualify to live. It is definitely like restricted. You know, capital, you know, the amount of rent you can charge to live there.
I would love more big A affordable housing.
I know, right,
Yeah.
right, which is challenging and why we have to only incentivize it to get it, because we can't require it. See why it's illegal for us to require more affordable. Yeah, it's like, I know this is like
Left
a,
over from.
it's just, yeah, it's just the political environment we live in Arizona. I mean, and that's not to say that there's other very progressive states that have required affordable housing. It's not illegal. It's absolutely required as part of new development, but that doesn't mean they don't have housing crises as well. Like California. So it's just such a big puzzle of pieces, and that's why we are trying to our hardest to also attack that attempt to lower the cost of a market rate unit as well with things like there's another one.
Well, that's kind of-
Commissioner Carlson
Oh, great.
would wanted to say something for a
Yeah.
bit.
So yeah, to kind of go off of the affordable housing. So again, how is that defined? Say that 10%. And then also in this, you know, like achieving or not achieving the affordable housing. I heard that part of that is based on, you know, rent or affordable housing programs, stuff like that. Is that all of it? Or do they-
So kind of like what makes
What makes
a
it
unit.
affordable?
What the little A, wants to know what the little A
And would
is.
you say?
I guess so, yeah.
Just ask it again. I didn't hear your question.
Oh, yeah, just clarifying what an affordable unit is, both in
Perfect. That
the
was,
housing plan and then also in the code concept.
Sure, yeah, no, it's funny, this whole time, I've been thinking about how there's really only a couple ways we can ensure a unit is capital A affordable, and that is the cost of it. Whether it's an ownership unit, we have a land trust program, we offer, I wish I knew, like the sales prices on some of our houses in our land trust program are like 250 right now, and so that is a restricted price and it's controlled through like, certain mechanisms. And we also restrict who is eligible to purchase that unit. So it's how much does the unit cost and what income level, I shouldn't say who, I should say which household income level is eligible to buy that, because there's such thing as, you can't, there has to be a cap on like a household income on being able to buy that house. So yes, the way we make a house or a housing unit officially affordable is to restrict the price of it and the income of the occupants. And there's also time frames where it's like, how long is that unit affordable for? Is it all permanently affordable? Is it only affordable for 30 years, like low-income housing tax credit projects? And after that 30 years expires, it's chaos because we lose all those affordable units at once. So that is what, in our housing world, like what affordable housing basically means and looks like. We talk about other little like affordable, it is because it's like, how low can we get the utility costs? Can we remove the cost of parking, the provision of parking for that unit, whether it's a single family home or like an apartment complex kind of a thing? What are all those added costs that end up in someone's rent payment? And can we impact those and kind of lessen those costs that the developers spend to get the unit constructed and then pass on to the tenant? So if we can make savings there, that is an improvement or a lessening of the cost of market rate housing. So the size, I think that's why we're talking about FAR so much and why we're so, interested in understanding how that might actually impact housing costs if we can actually reduce some of the size of these units. Obviously a 1,000 square foot house is probably gonna cost less than like a 3,000 square foot house. So yeah, things like that.
Can I add something, Jen?
Sure.
So one other way that's super simple, although great job, is that the US Department of Housing and Urban Development had their definition for affordable housing is that no one pays more than 30% of their gross annual income on housing expenses, on housing and housing related expenses. So that doesn't matter how much you make, right? Whether you're a doctor or you're a sales clerk, you want to make sure that no one pays more than that 30% of what they make on housing. And so that's a simpler definition of.
Thank you. That's a really big part of it.
well, Flagstaff, can a city employee afford a house? Of course, I didn't think so, yeah.
Even a teacher.
So
Exactly,
follow
yeah.
up to that.
That's what I meant.
So like the language saying that like all these scenarios are unlikely to increase the affordable housing stock on its own, is that the big A affordable? So technically, the greater housing stock could become more affordable because there's more units on the market.
Right.
And they could be smaller units based on these levers, right? I'd be interested to know like what the little A, affordable housing, I don't know what like achievements could be within these scenarios.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't understand, what's the difference between a big A and a little A?
Well, it seems like this big A affordable house is like part of these programs and income restricted and stuff like that, that sometimes it's even hard to fit into the box as a average resident to qualify for these programs. Where like just saying in general, for the average resident that maybe wants to buy something that, doesn't want to be in a program or something, our house is cheaper, or are they more affordable based on their income?
So I think, I'm.
Looking for
we
more
probably
stats
need
on that.
to
Yeah.
Go back to the
Yeah.
question, just make
Yeah.
sure we have time, but I think that's a great question, and there's only so much we can do, but the idea is that these changes would help move in that direction, but developers, respond to the market, like there's a lot outside of our control, but that our code, those code elements could lead us to maybe smaller units that are more affordable, or with the sustainability features, like have lower utility bill, which is a huge part of affordability. So I don't know if we're gonna give you the quite concrete answer you're looking
Okay.
for, but I think the idea is that, are we moving in that direction versus the direction we're kind of in right now, as these larger single-family homes that use a lot of energy, and we don't have sustainability standards baked into our code very much, so I think that's the way I like to think about it, if that's helpful.
Yeah, that's great.
And then, one last question, and then we can keep going.
I was gonna go back to the question. but-
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know, I guess I'm just wondering as far as like, the question is about what outcomes are preferred. And I just feel like when we're looking at outcomes, like, it seems pretty obvious as far as sustainability goes, the outcomes we want are from scenario 2. But I don't know, so how, is there a way that you can pair the sustainability outcomes with the housing plan in a way that, I'm just thinking, can somebody get the affordability incentives at the same time as getting sustainability incentives? Because like you were saying, monthly bills are a big part of affordability, so it seems like sustainability incentives can make affordability more common. But can you, I guess my question is just, can you get both of those incentives in the same development?
Well, right now, you can't, you kind of get one or the other, right?
The reality is, like, there's nothing, it's not
Yeah.
prohibited, the challenge is they compete against each other.
Yeah.
And we already have things in the code that are preventing a developer from even achieving that minimum density. And so the reason why you're gonna usually take an incentive is because you want more density than what you're allowed to have. Or you probably want like a parking reduction or a reduction to your resource protection overlay. So few developers can even achieve their minimum density that they are very seldom in the realm that they need to use the incentive. So that's what the current system is. Can we make them work so that you can use them together? Yes, but that's super complicated. Some of the idea of kind of going more to that by right density, then you do more on the incentive side from incentives, is because then they're already getting the one thing and they don't need that. They don't need to have competing incentives. But the answer is yes, because we could. It's just, that's a much harder product to get because they're gonna be competing against each other, if that makes sense.
And I think another way to frame this is, another realization is, in this report, it's really clear. I just think the nature of sustainability is so broad and it touches on so many different aspects of development and utilities and the built environment and transportation, that there are so many ways for development to be carbon neutral, more sustainable, contribute to walkability, lower emissions, lower utility amounts, green passive solar design. And we can pick those features and make them code requirements. And I think we're trying to understand, what kind of selection of those sustainable features. We have a question about actually, like the menu of sustainability features. If we can get a lot of those options built into the code as a requirement, and it can be an option. We're not dictating like every development must have all of these things. Bam, it's like, well, choose from these that we think are really high impact in achieving our carbon neutrality. That takes the pressure off of incentives to make progress on those sustainability goals. And it kind of maybe would allow the affordable housing incentives to shine. I'm not even necessarily like advocating for, like, obviously we want to be able to incentivize greater sustainable features. But it's so interesting because there's so many different ways to require sustainable and green features, and we cannot require below market
That's the
But
bottom
I
line,
think
and
the
there it was.
feedback that we're, I think two things really quickly,
There's the
to keep us moving is,
Yeah.
you gotta remember that we are updating the building code. And so that is gonna get us further in energy efficiency. So we kind of have to recalibrate some of this to understand, because with it, as Jen's point, it's broad. It's not just gonna be through the zoning code where we get sustainability. It's gonna be through our building code and other things. But the second thing I think what I'm hearing you say is it's feedback. If we're going to go incentive routes or where there's incentives, balancing them so that we can get both incentives. And just so kind of responding to that when we come back.
One of the caveats is that if they're getting these incentives, they were, one of the, I think they have to have a certain percentage of apartments, it would be for low income, isn't that correct? Wasn't it one of them? So that's about the best you can go. You can't say to them, but you're also gonna keep the rent low, aren't you? Because they're gonna say, nope, we're gonna charge what we want. You have all the incentives you want, but we're gonna still charge $5,000.
Well, that's not how our incentives work. I mean, they actually do lock you into a certain price point.
That was what she said. So you're saying they don't have anything to do with the rent amount. You can't control that.
If you're receiving an incentive, we expect an affordable unit in exchange. And it has to be a minimum, it's like our minimum is 2%.
Commissioner Metzer, just to clarify what Jen was talking about, the state does not allow us to require
Right,
affordable housing. But if someone does do it, then we can require that it states that it is affordable.
If they provide it and they've done it through taking an incentive, then we
Right.
can. So
Okay.
there's,
So one of the
Right
hooks
now-
on the incentive is a reduced,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
That's what it's.
yes, you don't just get to say you're doing it. It's
Right.
deed restricted and it's for 30 years.
Okay, thank you.
So, yes, thank you.
But we only have 35 minutes left in some more questions, so I guess it kind of sounded like, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's interest in the outcomes in scenario 2 with additional support for affordable housing. Is that kind of where the discussion is going?
And if I can
Yeah.
clarify, we have 7 questions. We are looking for your head nods or your comments here, and we are gonna start going pretty quickly through this. So just to like be, we really want to hear from all of you.
Okay, this is directly just answering the question. So I mean, if we could do what you're saying with implementing sustainable building standards into our code, it seems like in that case, scenario 3 would be the best outcome, because then you can start doing this as requiring sustainability standards. So I guess if you can require sustainability standards, I'd say scenario 3 would be my.
But the
Sorry,
question
Val.
is, are there any zoning districts that should be excluded or treated differently? And we're answering no.
Well, I was asking. this
first
question.
And that's actually in scenario 2.
Okay, so that's, you can't do the required codes for sustainable development
You
in
can.
scenario 3.
Scenario 3 just didn't incorporate them in the testing, but we can choose to go forward and pick from,
Okay.
the requirements from scenario 1.
Sure, so I'm being rated, you
That
can
was-
maximize both. I'd say that's the required for good preferred outcome.
So we have a density question, a couple of density questions next. If we get hot to.
One
Do
quick,
you feel like you got answers to the first 2?
Yes. Or
I don't know, have we talked about zoning districts at all?
Yeah, we didn't get any answers to that one.
Yeah.
I don't know if we like, just like, is this one of the zoning district like maps?
We're like, we're not asking if they should be treated uniformly, right? Just if they should have
Like
different standards. So
residential,
each zoning
commercial,
district can have its own set of
we
standards.
want to protect any or elevate any particular zoning district over another, or have the standards or requirements be different for that.
I think more vehicle miles traveled. I said this last time, but more vehicle miles traveled should have higher sustainability incentives and more parking possibilities.
That was a great suggestion last time.
Any other comments on that one?
Hasn't there already been like proposed, talking about like the main corridors and main commercial business districts as being, are those treated differently or are those like part of the plan? So
We can get into that actually with this
Okay.
question about density. So
Yeah.
this first question just has to do with where we want to see more density. And should we focus that density increases in areas where people are already driving less? to achieve, more reduced emissions, more walkability. So it's sort of like a geographical kind of context.
This feels like it's a part of the first question.
Well, the first one asks about specific zones, types of zones, so like specific residential zones or commercial zones. And this one's kind of more large, like where do we want to concentrate it? So as Commissioner Carlson talked about, commercial corridors, do we want to concentrate density along commercial corridors? Versus you can do that, and you can also, the first question was like, are there specific zones that might be spread across the city? So those are related, but slightly different questions. But we can focus on big picture location, because that's what this question asks about.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So areas where people tend to drive less than average probably include areas that have mixed zoning for residential and commercial. If we are changing the code to increase density outside of those pre-identified areas, in the future, are we considering changing some of the code so that there could be mixed commercial, so that people in those areas could drive less?
I think we talked about that in the
Right.
regional plan.
Yeah, so,
Like further out areas.
yeah, like I think I would definitely be pro increase density everywhere with the like foresight of, and then maybe we would rezone in the future to have those areas be more walkable for getting to the grocery store and getting to the clinic and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Right?
That's also a huge component of that, in addition to having that mix of uses being served by transit.
Yeah.
And we know that in like greenfield areas, we probably want to achieve densities of 8 units an acre, just support the expansion of transit. And that's like the bare minimum of where we need to go to get to transit. But on top of it, we also need to look at the mix of land uses. The mix of land uses is less this project and a little like the mix of commercial and residential. I mean,
Yeah.
we're definitely down with mixed use and all of those good things, but where those combinations of zonings are gonna hit is gonna be more relative to the general plan and where we pick that up in like the new greenfield areas. But yes, it definitely is something to be explored.
Yeah, I'm just thinking if we're expected to plan 100 years out for having 96,000 more units, like maybe some of those units we need to rezone and have it be so that our city is more walkable anyway. So I would say increase density anywhere. Be my vote.
Go ahead, Commissioner Warren.
You go ahead first.
I was just gonna say, a lot of these things seem to be dependent on other factors. Just like what Kristen was pointing out, like, well, if this, then but. And so I think like, when I look at a black and white question, do you want to increase density allowances? I don't have a good response to that because it's not a yes or no question. So if it is scalable, right? So we
Yeah.
talked about 8 units being what you just need to support transit. So when you're talking about sort of like that would be the lower end of our density spectrum. That would be what, like the minimum of what we're trying to achieve. But in terms of like high density, like the really big, dense, like tall buildings, would you want to focus those on, say, existing transit corridors or within areas that are already, that's kind of the way it's a scalable question, right?
Well, that was my point about this connected to the question before. The answer to, are there any zoning districts that should be excluded, was we should be paying attention to low vehicle miles traveled. So then the next question is, should by right density increases be limited to those areas? So we've already said, yes, we should give those areas more attention, but not everything.
Do transit corridors only apply to where bus lines are, or also where like there's good bike infrastructure?
I mean, I just picked transit. Usually transit is most likely gonna be in alignment with the bike and ped facilities. I mean, but I think more, it's about the permanent transit corridor.
That's really what we focus on when we talk about, even in the regional plan, is that permanent transit. And you need the bodies to like get served so that can expand, but right now we're really talking about that core area.
Tiffany, you mentioned that 8, what is that, 8?
8 unit
Unit.
acre.
Yeah. So if that was implemented for like kind of the outer reaches to help the transit But then we also did the like high density on these commercial corridors. Would that secondary incentive with a high density all of a sudden make those outer areas become single family again? Or will these other levers still help it, increase small units and a few more units on these single family homes and stuff like that? Cause like I'm worried that like, yes. okay.
Yes, I mean, it's all a guess. I mean, it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
all a
yeah.
guess, but yes, that's the intention.
That it,
That it will, that the triggers, so, the 8, so right now, our single family residential, we have a maximum density of 6 units per acre. We're really achieving, in the best cases, between 2 and 4 units an acre in single family development. Most of the existing stuff you'll see is closer to, some of the newer stuff you're seeing is closer to 4, but you can see how we're just like, we're not even getting to that. But if the new norm becomes around 8, and we're accomplishing that 8 by adding in sort of the missing middle types, we're seeing duplexes and triplex intermixed with single family dwellings, as well as larger multifamily and mixed use developments. Yeah, I mean, that's the ultimate goal and hope, is to give our zoning that broad breadth to allow that freedom of space to happen more easily. And if we do it through zoning, then when those developers go through and rezoning cases, when you want to add in multifamily to an area that's primarily been single family, that's when the friction happens.
so you're saying both can be achieved, the like increasing density in the outskirts and lower density areas and quite a bit of density in these main corridors and incentivize it. Okay, just clarify.
Question more.
So this is kind of answering both first question and second question on this. I don't know if there's a way to do this, but I feel like there's kind of an agreement here that we don't want to limit the density to a certain one area, but there's obviously more important areas for this. So I don't know if we could, but if possible, to prioritize like low vehicle miles traveled with affordable housing, the density in those areas first priority. Then second priority would be low vehicle miles traveled that maybe isn't affordable, and then so on until it's all the way out till the farthest or most vehicle miles traveled. Yeah, exactly. Or well, inside city limits. So, but yeah, I don't know. Prioritizing those would be my answer to both those questions.
Yeah, this question about this kind of second level, do we want to increase the density allowance for just affordable housing projects? Or should we be increasing density for all housing development?
Is there a belief that market rate will be driven by comfort levels? So if somebody's gonna say, oh, you know what, we're gonna build a big dorm off of Lake Mary Road and we're gonna charge the kids $2,000 an apartment, But because of the market rate, they're not gonna get that $2,000. So will that address those kinds of things? This notion that all high density would be good isn't necessarily positive. If
Correct, well, especially if it's not paired with these other
Right.
levers we're trying to get to control.
What generally will set that value in that multifamily, especially in ones that are oriented to certain populations, is the amenities they offer. It's the amenities that allow them to offer a higher rent.
Next one,
Yeah, I would say for all.
Increase.
Yeah.
I just have a quick question. If you want to give a quick answer, that's fine. But the way that low vehicle miles traveled are calculated, is that taking into consideration the J.W. Powell development?
It was the maps in the report are based on existing areas, so it's not really inclusive. But we also know that there's some flaws in that map too. But what we're seeing, we know reflects certain areas like the commercial corridors and the transit lines and areas where we have good, well-rounded transportation options. So that would be the focus point for low VMT.
Okay, I'm just thinking like for where I grew up in the Continental area, I probably was not in low vehicle miles traveled for most of my life, but
once JW Powell's there, probably a lot of places will be with less vehicle miles traveled. So I don't know, maybe considering that in that calculation would help.
There's gonna be some roads from Samson and Wolfsburg down to the.
Yeah.
So the FAA have a question. It is really fairly simple. Like, does the commission support using FAR to help manage the intensity of residential land uses?
Yes.
All right, we can hop to the question number 4 about parking. So remember, a major finding of the report is that we can't make a whole lot of progress on more housing production without some reduction to the parking. So
Yes, we support that.
okay, and so these kind of important follow-up questions. Like, should parking be left to a developer or like the market conditions to make that determination? Should we eliminate standards altogether?
I have a comment on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that, eliminating standards altogether in certain applications would be a great step in the right direction. For example, like for ADUs, eliminate the requirement for ADUs.
They're already eliminated
Yeah.
by state law.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Eliminating minimums and maybe like downtown. Busy areas, high traffic corridors. And eliminating parking requirements, you know, developers will build in, like the market can determine what developers will build. Developers won't build something with no parking. In many cases. And so I think I wouldn't say something like that sweeping across the board, but like really thinking about where it might be strategic and, you know, support like a more walkable downtown or more like areas that are already dense or developed.
I have a question about my understanding of the current law. If there is a minimum required parking, that means that a developer cannot charge their resident, landlord can't charge the resident for that parking spot, correct?
Yeah, that's true.
So that means, because they're saying like they have to have.
We can get off of that, regulate that level of variance.
No, it just requires the minimum amount of spaces on the site. A landlord can unbundle their rent from their parking, which is actually part of transportation demand management, so it can help shift people away from single occupancy vehicles, so it can be a good tool, especially if other options are easy, they're close to a bus, or if they have biking, for example. But yeah, the zoning code does not get into whether they can charge for that.
It just wants there to be any unintended, oh my gosh, now
That's,
we put parking on and now we charge for it.
that's already incorporated. It's just part of the property fees or part of the construction fees or part of the price of the
Right.
home or the apartment or the rent. So that already is there.
And by reducing that, it's potential of reducing the prices of
Exactly.
those units.
Well,
Exactly.
you saw the hotel downtown, buy the lot across the street. Tear it down.
Yeah.
So they'll do that.
That's minimums. They had to.
No, I don't, they had to. That was one of the big questions. Where's everybody in park? And they went, they just bought the lot.
They did have to meet minimum parking requirements when they built that.
Oh,
So there's a chance like,
Yeah,
yeah, there's a chance by law they had to buy.
they had to have parking. Yeah. I don't know the specifics of that development, but they did have minimum parking standards. So they had Commissioner Wilkins brought up a good point about just the cost of parking too. So it costs $2,000 to $5,000 to build the surface space, one surface parking space. I think it's like 35,000 for a parking garage. So definitely if we're thinking about affordability and costs, parking is a big part of that in terms of the initial construction costs, but then obviously cost of operating a vehicle. So there's lots of options to help kind of and transportation demand management, which is a later question. I think it's the next one. They can talk about alternatives that kind of unbundle parking and rents. Provide your
Last question about should on-street parking be addressed in conjunction with the reduction in parking standards? As like
What do you mean by addressed? Like, it should be part of the conversation.
regarding, like if we suddenly, well, right, if we suddenly have less parking available, it's gonna take a long time for everybody to adjust to less and less parking available. So we need to be looking at offsite impacts. like in the downtown or in neighborhoods, if no parking is provided on a infill triplex or something where, that doesn't mean there won't be cars anywhere.
Right.
And so that's kind of connected actually to another question we had later about, I'm losing, snow removal and our ability to use or not use streets for parking year round. So it's just kind of acknowledging that if you take parking away, we anticipate having to offer up some other strategies
Yes.
to solve chaos.
It's just trying to go for a profit model and get somebody to build a garage. I mean, the higher cost to park, the less people are gonna drive.
Yeah, that's a market situation. So trying to save the little a.
Right.
We don't want to
Right.
have people have to pay for parking on top of paying for it.
I think we have a lot of tourist parking though too, right? I mean, it's not just residents. That's one of the challenges with the cars and the parking and all of that is the visitors.
Well, what happens is the people who don't want to pay the fee park down the street in front of somebody's house.
Well, exactly. Well, you don't let them. You put the neighbor, I mean, I got towed last week in Florida. Yeah, well, I parked in it.
Florida.
We were in Little Havana. We were doing a tour and then all the signs said, no parking unless you got the neighborhood pass. And we thought it made an exception for the weekend and it didn't. And $200 later, we get our car back in the tow.
See the people in downtown. Neighborhood pass.
Yeah, I think we gotta.
15 minutes, guys. What, any other final comments on parking or should we move to the,
Yes.
you do?
I just want to say, I definitely think on-street parking should be addressed, especially if there's no minimums, because then in the case that you can't park for 6 months on the side of the street and there's no minimums, all of a sudden, where are you gonna park?
We'll get there.
And like, I think, well, we might not. I don't know,
Well,
I'd like to
we
push
can.
support for like the minimum. And then like, maybe not in conjunction, but like, of course, in the holistic, you guys are taking this holistic picture. That like, maybe not in conjunction, but like, yes, let's address, some consequences that might have. And, there's a lot of like park district things and demand-based pricing and stuff like that.
So yeah, that's kind of like flows into this two-part question here with, if, you guys, I can't imagine this is really controversial here. If you're in support of a menu of sustainable design standards that developers would choose from, you can see like it would achieve, we can kind of figure out later what exactly those requirements would be. And transportation demand management strategies could be included as part of that to help address the parking concerns. Does that sound good to everybody?
Yes. I did have a question on that though. It seems really good on the surface. I'm curious on like, from a development perspective, if it actually causes hurdles and increased costs. Like, I think there's a serious concern there with like, you require these or, their bonuses or however you go about it. But then all of a sudden, the development is pricey again. And so like, do we achieve some of these sustainability things by going higher density and like, kind of indirect or having some incentives? I just worry that they will become barriers. And so like, that's a big question. I don't know if any of that can be clarified, or how that can be balanced.
I think one thing to think about is there's a lot of different features and they have different upfront costs too. Some can be lower, some a little bit higher. But the idea too is that anytime we have additional standards, we offset that by the density increases in parking. So basically kind of ask for something, but give something at the same time. So there's kind of, again, it's hard because they're like puzzle pieces, but say you have an all-electric building, which a bunch of studies have shown is actually cheaper than building mixed, gas and natural gas and electric buildings. You're not installing that natural gas infrastructure, right? So say you're doing an all-electric building and, sorry, got distracted. One of those I just went thought. But basically, so say you're doing that, even if it did cost a little bit more, say you have less parking. So you're spending way less on building, you're saving $35,000 per parking space. So I think that's really helps me to think about it more holistically, as well as think about some features cost more, but some might actually cost less upfront. But even if they cost a little more, often the operating costs are a lot lower. So for example, if you have additional insulation, really minimal to maybe not very minimal upfront costs, but really long-term cost savings. So I think definitely agree with you. Don't want these to be a barrier, but I think there's a lot of different options. And so that's where that menu could come in. And so developers kind of pick, well, for my development, like this is feasible for me, like these options feel good for me. I'm gonna choose this subset of the larger options as well. So providing that flexibility hopefully helps with that. But yeah,
Okay,
you're,
and
yeah.
one other maybe suggestion, if this is implemented, that kind of in the way that the ADUs are, will have pre-approved plans, like things that streamline the process even through that menu first.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of the menu too, but I think, I'm thinking back to the class I took at CCC, that was a construction management class, and half the class was there because they were building their own home and they just wanted to learn sustainable practices to build it. So I think on this menu, it feels like it's a little limiting, like here's your options to get these incentives and those are your options. So I just think that there should be some level of more flexibility, like an other option, and you can apply to the city and say that this is what else I'm doing that's not on the menu, and see if that can get you your incentives.
You did say there's a lot of ways to go about.
I think
sustainable
so.
development.
Yeah, and I definitely think we have a lot more work to do digging into that. Yeah, the cost benefit analysis of this is like a medium expensive addition, but it really dramatically impacts like your carbon footprint or reduces, I should say.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I think in my head, I would love to see eventually somehow we could figure it out, like another version of like a stoplight analysis of all of these sustainability features and their costs relative to their impact on our goals.
All right, we can do the next
Let's
two.
do it. All right, question 6 is about reduced street widths. So yeah, do you guys support developing a strategy and a process
Yes.
for creating narrower streets?
Yes.
Because it allows us a bit more density in neighborhoods.
I say yes, but I think that the street parking needs to be considered somehow.
I think that the catch here was it was local street design options. So I think there would be like a hierarchy of, we aren't touching these bigger streets, or maybe we would, I don't know.
Yeah, let's focus on residential.
Yeah.
Within this frame, we have sidewalks, is that right?
The last question then, unless there's any other follow-up. All right, so the winter part, we didn't even get to this slide on the last. But yeah, so do you guys support developing a strategy and a process for replacing our current winter
Yes.
parking ordinance?
Yes.
Yes, that was good.
Couple of the challenges.
Especially if
Do
you have
we
like
have-
these dry winters and then that there's a blanket regulation against parking.
When it's.
I live in the North Pole of
Yeah.
Arizona.
Yeah, exactly.
My neighborhood was that one that had this huge high snow that drifts and the postman couldn't get through.
Do any of these alternative concepts that if we have a minute or two to delve into any of these alternatives, do any of them sound more reasonable to the group? That are local conditions. Like 2 for our big winters is probably the most reasonable. We have a huge snow winter. Number 3 seems like it would be really chaotic.
I like number 3 personally.
If I put other, like what do other cities do that works? I feel like.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna add. This is based off of research into small cities, college cities that are snowy, et cetera. These are models that are used across the country.
I think if they're tried and true in other similar places, then I support trying it here.
I think 2 is the word, it reminds me of New York City, and that sometimes does work. The problem being that, they say, somebody from the radio says we're gonna have a whole bunch of snow this weekend, and then we don't get it. And the next weekend, there's no snow, and we get a whole bunch of it, then what do we do?
Oh, are you leaving?
No.
Why are you sleeping?
I'm sure he gets that quite a bit.
Okay,
This was really your turn.
Follow up, I feel like.
So I know that affordable housing, some of our climate goals are addressed maybe on a higher level, but I'm curious if there are more specific outcomes for like our climate neutrality plan, like, which one gets us closer there? Is it the sustainable one or is it the higher density one that might have indirect sustainable benefits?
Oh, you're talking about which scenario gets you closer?
Closer to our climate neutrality plan goal.
I can pull up.
I mean, like, yeah, like more,
Of like,
yeah.
But and,
Are you talking about the menu option?
and it's because of all of the levers that they.
Yeah, more like these different, yeah, these different
That visual,
scenarios and stuff. like
that visual spoke directly to CMP goals, so that's why it was a high. So that way, that's like the,
Oh, yeah.
oh, yeah.
So these were in the memo, for this meeting. We didn't have them in the presentation, but this is scenario 2. So that kind of breaks down, and these were all in the original code diagnosis report, and they were distilled from both the 10-year housing plan and the carbon neutrality plan. And so we went through and looked at how each scenario, and it could address each of those kind of sub outcomes within each of the plans. So this was scenario 2. It had the best outcomes for both housing and climate. As we can see, affordable housing was low, but that doesn't mean that we can't include things to help affordable housing in a final scenario while also having pretty high in all the other outcomes as well. So does this answer your
I
question?
think so, yeah, I understand. These are specific. Yeah, and another quick follow-up, if you don't mind, is what did the housing commission think on some of these like sustainability menu options? Like, because I know they're likely less sustainability focused and more like, you know, just pro. Likely.
I have my notes.
I was
Yeah,
gonna say.
I have my notes. Let's see. They were interested in unbundling parking from rent, just to reduce housing costs for folks who don't have a car. They were interested in details and really how much stuff costs upfront. They were in favor of potentially lower cost sustainability features, menu of sustainability features. Or if things do increase the cost, then they're supporting additional things that decrease the cost. That kind of goes back to like, if we have less parking, we're saving a lot of money there. Maybe we can spend more on insulation or something like that.
Right.
So yeah, they wanted more information on costs, but you know, they recognize that the sustainability stuff can be a big part of affordability in the long term as well.
Thanks so much.
Zoning commission part of this picture too.
They are, but we went to them a month ago. We haven't gone back recently, so. I don't remember exactly what they said. It's a while.
Well, I think the questions were formatted a little differently.
Yeah.
So when we went there, we had the larger presentation. It was definitely formatted differently.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about something.
Yeah, they have a different, like their view on this is way different, and so they're kind of taking it more technical.
Plan against.
And actually, so we will likely go back to them more as this is what we've heard, kind of reframing it, but they have a different role, right? Because they then make recommendations, amendments to council once we get to that point. So they'll play a very active role. So we're gonna keep them attuned at the same time, so. Have you guys think answer? Thank you for letting me.
Committee, I kept saying, "Hey, we're talking about this." You know, that's been
Yes.
Helpful. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's
Right.
helpful. Has it been helpful for you?
Yeah, do you
Yeah,
feel
it has.
better?
It has, we,
You know, it's that crystal clear.
yeah, I like hearing that there are options. This is not the final outcome. This is an iterative process. So all of those things make me happy and I learn things tonight, so. We do have a couple more things on the agenda. I would like to power through, but try not to keep us more than like 5 minutes over time. And I want to apologize to the commissioners for not making the 2-hour goal here. I will work harder on that in the future. So the next item on the agenda is a quick working group update from Tia.
Yeah.
Maybe less than
thank
5
you.
minutes if
Yep.
possible. Of course.
Yeah, thank you to Amy and Roger and Tom for helping plan the upcoming networking and recognition event. It is going to be held during our next month's meeting time on March 27th. We will need additional support, but it's about approximately 5 to 7 p.m. It's going to be held at the Market of Dreams, and there'll be kind of an interactive activity and refreshments served. And I can send more details via email. We have an RSVP form, a flyer, and then we'll
get in touch with the working group to schedule our next meeting too. Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Tia. And then next item on the agenda is the fiscal year 23-24 Neighborhood Sustainability Grant Project Extension Request.
Yeah.
Which Tia will also summarize for us.
Yes, so basically the 1-year project period ends at the end of February. And so we've had a few requests come in. And that final project kind of period includes like a final report survey and the final presentation, which is in March. And so we've had 3 requests come in. Flagstaff Junior Academy. That one, I have to admit, we actually got a couple months ago and I just completely kept forgetting to add it. So that one is the one that Roger brought up last time, that it's just completely dependent on their entire school's building construction schedule to do their forest garden flooring. And so they did provide a letter requesting the extension, and I would definitely highly recommend voting to approve that one because it's just really out of their hands, the construction timeline for that aspect. And then the next one, and you can decide to do all of these at once or in different ways, is Flagstaff Community Fridges. They have been able to get their structure in and their fridge installed, which is amazing, but that just happened. And so they're actually really interested in having more time to figure out like the data and get more results to provide back to you all. And so
I think the Murdoch Center is the.
they are at the Murdoch Center. And so that one is kind of like, you know, do you want to give them like 6 months? How much data do we want, or like how much? Otherwise, like the funds have been expended at this point. And then kind of similarly is for the last one, the Peaceful Valley Permaculture Project, is the funds have also been expended for that one. But this one is just really at the whim of nature, and given the really dry conditions, it's Thaddeus Gates, who is running the project, just hasn't been able to see the results that he wants to provide. And also some key project partners have left and he's seeking additional support. So there's more outline there, but the site doesn't have running water. So they just haven't, any of the seeds, none of the seeds have taken off yet. So
Did they write you a substantive libel?
I did end up asking some follow-up questions for community fridges and Peaceful Valley Permaculture, and I felt like both of them were sufficient. They asked for, Peaceful Valley asked for a year extension, which feels fine.
Well, you can't recover the money, right? I mean, it's already been.
No, and
allocated, spent.
they spent it, and it's, I mean, they've expended the funds. It's not like for this project in particular, like we wouldn't expect for a permaculture project to show results necessarily in a year either,
Well, there's no guarantee of results in any of these, right? So what's the
especially the ones with Mother Nature for sure.
Well, they're learning from that.
construction?
Yeah.
So I guess if I were to summarize my recommendations, it'd be to approve FJA's extension. I think theirs is also through May or June. Let's double check that really quick. They included it in here. Begin work on their project March 2025. So that might be like a September, I don't know, just kind of see how construction goes for them. And then community fridges, I would say like maybe a 6 months extension. So they can start getting some data and see how it goes for the first 6 months of having the fridge, and then providing that 1 year extension to the Peaceful Valley Permaculture.
And then would all 3 of these projects present back to the commission in 2026?
I would propose that they still come to our event in March because we've changed up the format. I think it's going to be really fun, and I would like to hear how things are going, or like, you know, it's available for the whole community. So even if FJA has not done anything because they can still talk about what they got funded to do and what the intention is.
Challenges are actually to talk about as
Yeah.
well as success.
So I think that
I agree. I will really highly encourage that. I can't guarantee that.
Right.
they'll
So
say
maybe
yes or
require that to get their extension, they have to come.
We'll give you your extension, bud.
Is there a motion to approve?
I move that we approve all of the requests for extensions.
Second.
Okay, is there any discussion on this motion to approve?
We have to give them the Black community bridges a time frame, but we'll choose.
I recommended like 6 months. So that we can still get the like report in essentially. The
6 months as of what date?
end of February, probably.
I would suggest middle of September, October, because that gives them some time after school.
Oh, this is community bridges.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought that was, I thought we were talking about, did you get
That's a great idea though for FJA.
Yeah.
I like that. So September, October, we can check in with them.
The community free just built it, it's a whole place for it, they've done a lot of work on this thing.
Was looking for food donations and volunteers. Yeah.
Right, so let's vote on the motion to approve all three of these extension requests. All in favor, say aye. Anybody against? Okay, and last, we'll go through this quickly, to and from. We've planned our a discovery stroll for the format where we'll have brief there'll be more information over email about the details. I think it's going to be really fun. One thing we have to decide is, do we want to schedule an alternative council meeting for next month? Because we're going to be doing this during our meeting time. You say yes. All in favor of that? Yes.
Okay.
I feel like,
Have a day.
we don't have suggestions for days.
Let me ask you this question. In years past, when they did the presentations, that was the meeting.
Yes.
So why would we do an extra meeting when we're doing a different form of presentation?
Just if we have a lot of business to discuss. I agree though. So what does everybody think?
I mean, the purpose of having the presentations be removed from the meeting format here was so that we would hold our meeting time. That was a prior chair's request to, because we were losing a month of meeting every
Okay.
year.
Remember
So-
that? I thought it was because they.
That was like 3 years ago. It was a long time ago.
Well, it was,
Takes a long time to make any sort of changes, but so that was the reason why we were like, let's make this more fun and more networking and more social and like maintain having a March meeting or whatever month.
Okay.
So just some backstory on
That's
why.
great. Okay, that's helpful. I feel like we have a lot of work to do. I also acknowledge that everybody spends a lot of time on this, so I support evaluating other times.
We'll come if I can.
Okay.
That's third.
That's what we're talking about.
March.
The week.
Third Thursday.
Yeah.
Yeah, propose that to folks. Just for context, we've, sent out a survey for all the attendees to pick the best Thursday, and the most people chose the
Right.
27th.
We
so.
were not trying to plan it. That was just one of the options, and that was where it landed for the most participants in the
Anyways,
grant
'cause we all
program.
expect to meet on that day. Like, I think it's
Yes,
important
the regular meeting.
that we all go to see your presentation.
The 20th. I am,
Y'all want a full 2 hours?
So now
Already
we're
know
looking
the
for the
agenda?
alternative date for a meeting?
I know we have a request to talk about micromobility, if that person's available to present on the day we choose. We still have to create like an ordinance working group, cut short the NSG discussion or the grant wrap-up discussion.
yes, I think it would be good
And
to.
the survey that we put
March.
out, if anyone hasn't taken the survey, please take it.
We have to move it, why don't we make it the third Thursday, since the fourth Thursday is the one we usually hold. We should make it the third Thursday of March.
I am.
That works for me.
As long as it's got- Okay,
That's what I usually put on my calendar. Anyway, I'm always.
So Tia will, follow up with a email about that. It sounds like at least 4 people can make it, so, so we'll do that. And then, there's a reminder to sign up for the monthly newsletter if you aren't already signed up. There's a lot going on, and any other to and froms? Anybody?
Oh, I do.
Yes.
I'm part of like a fundraising committee for a nonprofit in town, High Country Adaptive Sports, and we're having like a very, very casual event on Saturday, 4 p.m. Hops on Birch. You show up, you get a free beer. It's recommended that you also maybe make a donation then, and we have like a raffle. And it's really an opportunity to like chit chat and get to know what the nonprofit is about. So it's just very casual, like come swing by, have a beer if you want to learn more. That's it. Awesome.
So what's the nonprofit? I'm sorry.
High Country Adaptive Sports, so they work on inclusive outdoor recreation for people with all sorts of abilities.
You'll send out a reminder or some kind of thing.
Yeah, I'll send the invite to Tia. And then she can
Just
figure
bring me
it
the
out.
free beer sticker.
Come have a beer. If you're gonna come have the beer, like, please also consider making a donation.
An alternative drive home. Someone else should drive or walk home.
A bicycle.
All right. Last item, does anybody have any future agenda item requests in addition to what is on the survey and things that Tia just mentioned?
I would like to suggest we discuss the concept of giving a star of some sort to businesses that do sustainable work. Like as an organization that we reinforce positive efforts that some businesses are making and maybe get kind of like best of flag.
Yeah, and maybe in that discussion, we can talk about what exists too.
Do we give stars out already?
We don't.
Okay.
Maybe the chamber.
Chamber does, we've had this conversation a lot over the years, so we can talk about that. It's incredibly staff time intensive. So that's just.
We'll talk about the Green Business Boot Camp too, and Innovate Green, which is coming up in April. So yes,
So put that on.
It's all business, right?
All right, meeting is adjourned. Sorry, everybody.
If I can just real quick, thank you all. I know.